family. It is the delight to be here with you, and of course, a delight to be reconnected with the Shire Suter family and with their Cordelia's parents. It's a delight to be here with all of you. This is going to be something that is somewhat unusual, but again, it combines two parts of my background. We're going to have a little bit of sermon, a little bit of seminar, and then hopefully a very fruitful discussion. I'm calling this talk the Samaritan Sensibility. And as I said, we'll do what would probably be a sermonette. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how I think one of Martin Luther King's pieces of writing, particularly Letter from Birmingham Jail, sort of dovetails into not only the sermon, but this moment. And then we'll hopefully get to some questions shortly thereafter. Luke's gospel is a gospel for the outcasts, for those on the margins. Even though he was a medical doctor and probably a man of means, Luke had a heart for those in pain and for the poor. Surely people are set aside and pushed aside for a number of reasons, some physical, others economic, and still others because of ethnicity or gender. Even Luke himself was a bit of an outsider among the first ambassadors of Jesus, since he was not Jewish. But Luke knew that outsiders could be accepted as insiders with a radically new vision of the kingdom of God. This would be strangely new idea for the religious elite of Jesus's time, namely how outsiders by God's grace could become insiders. The message of bridging communities and broadening circles so that outsiders become insiders is timeless. This message is relevant and fresh for every generation because every generation, as we see now in our time, must grapple with our human impulse for cliques, for our human impulse to divide. So the old story of the Good Samaritan resounds in our social media moment as practically as it did when Jesus shared this parable 2,000 years ago. I thank Myron for reading this parable in its entirety because it really reveals a lot for us. I want to suggest to you, for the sake of time and for getting our hands around what we're going to be talking about today, that this text reveals, at minimum, two timeless takeaways regarding how we relate to each other without looking past each other. And that first takeaway is this. The first takeaway is who a neighbor could be. Who a neighbor could be. Our desire to connect can be overshadowed by our impulse to divide and distinguish ourselves from others. Unfortunately, dividing and distinguishing can lead to discriminating and dominating. It had for the people during Jesus's time, and it can during our time. That's why Jesus' answer to the question, who is my neighbor, in this parable is both rhetorical and informational. Rhetorical because the man that asked Jesus that question should have known that even in the Old Testament, God's definition of neighbor extended beyond one's community. But Jesus' narrative is not only rhetorical, it's also informational, because his questioner did not know how broadly the definition of neighbor could extend. Through the story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus broadened and deepened, as well as heightened the definition of neighbor beyond his community's imagination. And I want to suggest that the definition of neighbor, when we want to begin to talk about it in relationship to racial injustice and racial strife, the larger issue is that God's definition of neighbor is far broader than ours. And it should stimulate our imagination to think more broadly as well. Remember, the Samaritans were excluded from being neighbors among Jesus's contemporaries because of their religion, their region, and what we would now call their race. They were considered half-breeds, to be rejected because they worshiped in the wrong place and with a limited portion of scripture. You remember that they were into, that is the Samaritans, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so this was used as a reason, one reason at least, to marginalize them. And we see this more clearly with the story of the woman at the well, where her idea of worship, the place of worship, differed from what the Jews had traditionally said, but Jesus wanted her to reimagine the place and the people that will worship God. I think the message for us is clear when we talk about the Samaritan sensibility and who a neighbor could be. Beware of restricting your imagination regarding the identity of who is my neighbor. But then not only do we have that takeaway, who a neighbor could be, but also what a neighbor should be. What a neighbor should be. If the first lesson from the Good Samaritan story is who a neighbor could be, and this is about identity, then the second lesson, what a neighbor should be, is about duty. Our duty is a greater privilege than our rights. Let me say that again. Our duty to one another is a greater privilege than our rights, and it is a higher calling than our responsibility. I mean, I think of even our religious rights, and I think of the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where as an apostle, he talks about, I have all of these rights, but my most preeminent calling is to become all things to all men, that by all means I might save a few. Even though this text does not explicitly say so, the man who fell by the side of the road likely hailed from the same background as the priest and Levite. Since the Samaritans were despised and since the Jericho road historically was a dangerous area, it's possible that the priest and the Levite would have passed this man up. Possible because of the danger on the road, but not because of his identity. But what I want us to notice is how far this responsibility of duty to one another extends. Notice the way the marginalized and maligned Samaritan behaved according to the loftiest definition of being a neighbor. That is, he wouldn't use the fact that he was marginalized as a reason not to help. And that's going to be very important when we get through this discussion. Notice what the Samaritan does. He does at least three things that lets us know what a neighbor should be as opposed to what a neighbor could be. Number one, when the Samaritan stops by the side of the road, he affirms the victim's humanity. You know, no matter what we think separates us, our vulnerability is our commonality. Sympathy and empathy are the concrete roads that can lead us from racial disharmony to harmony, indeed, to any kind of disharmony to harmony, recognizing each other's humanity. We all feel it, don't we? We all feel that we need sympathy and empathy now and again. And sympathy and empathy is what brings us together. When in Huckleberry Finn, Huck uses a derogatory term we would now recognize as a derogatory term to describe the enslaved person, Jim, that he was helping escape. He makes the comment when Jim gets hurt that you bleed too. We all bleed too. And it is that blood of humanity, and more importantly for us as Christians, the blood of Christ that brings us together and hopefully helps us to identify our vulnerability and our limitations. But not only that, when the Samaritan takes the victim to the inn, he advocates for his dignity. You see, affirming humanity is just not enough. If we learn anything from the prophets, particularly the minor prophets, we know that every now and then advocation is important. It's important to advocate and to stand up when we need to advocate and stand up. You remember the famous words of Micah, I'm sure we do. Micah chapter 6 and verse 8, and he has shown thee, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. To stand up and speak up and move forward when we need to is a part of advocating. Being a victim of pain, poverty, crime, abuse, or discrimination doesn't just scar our bodies. These experiences scar our spirits and diminish our sense of dignity. Carrying someone a cup of water or carrying someone to an emergency room can make them feel more than compassion. Such acts bestow the highest sense of self-esteem. You matter enough for me to sacrifice. And I think that's another important issue to think about throughout the study, at least, of many kinds of literature. But for our purposes, I'll just give an example from African American literature. Whether you're talking about Frederick Douglass, 19th century escaped slave who became an abolitionist, or Martin Luther King, constantly they talked about that the act of being inhumane to someone because of their race not only scarred the object of that scorn, but it scarred those who exercise that scorn. But then thirdly, when the Samaritan offers to come back to check on the victim, he pledges allegiance to the human family. Ultimately, this parable, not to mention the trick question that precipitates it, is about relationships, how to create, how to cultivate, and how ensure that relationships flourish. Whether we are talking about racial strife or other forms of social division, and we'll come back to this hopefully, we must distinguish between significant allegiances and ultimate allegiances. We don't tell people to give up their allegiances, whether it's to their family background, certainly not to their country, and maybe not even to other areas of distinction. Those differences are significant, but they're not ultimate. The ultimate allegiance is to our God, and that's who brings us together. But some of these themes now I want to illustrate by looking at Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And I think it will illustrate a lot of what I've been saying about the Good Samaritan story. It will not illustrate all of it, but in terms of who a neighbor could be and what a neighbor should be, that general arc, I think we'll see it. So let's go through a letter from the Birmingham jail for a moment. So first of all, the immediate context of Letter from a Birmingham Jail. When we talk, of course, about Martin Luther King's career, we are not talking about the first one who stood for Black rights or African American rights. We know there's a very long history in our country and elsewhere. But the two bookends to think about when you think about Letter from the Birmingham Jail, before it would be the Montgomery bus boycott, which was precipitated, of course, by Rosa Parks' refusal to give a white man a seat on a bus. And then, of course, Martin Luther King, in some ways, was drafted as a new pastor in that area of Montgomery to lead this 387-day bus boycott, what became 387 days. And of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is another bookend. This occurred after the letter from a Birmingham jail, because Birmingham was what would have been for Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the last stand for the civil rights movement. If they had not been successful in Birmingham, the movement would have gone another way. And so Martin Luther King is invited to come to Birmingham in 1963. He turns the heat on along with Southern Christian Leadership Conference in terms of demonstrations from April to May. And in between that time, on April 12th, 1963, he is thrown in a jail, which he was very accustomed to, very willing to do. And during the letter from Birmingham jail, we'll talk a little bit about the author and audience. King is placed in jail for protesting injustice in Birmingham. 8 local and moderate clergymen is to whom he writes. Now, I've got to be very clear here. These 8 local and moderate clergymen in Birmingham were Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Jewish. And they believed that Blacks should eventually receive their rights. But they objected to, as many did, the fact that King was not from Birmingham, so he was, a famous moniker, outside agitator. But also they objected to King's timetable. What I want you to see, though, is how King relates to those who are opposing him. Something that I think is very important for our time and our moment, and for any discussion, particularly one as consequential as the discussion about racial injustice and the move towards racial inclusion. First of all, there's some connections you need to see in the letter from the Birmingham jail. King connects with the people with whom he disagrees, these 8 clergymen, with at least 3 points or 3 areas. Number 1, a common humanity. Number 2, common intellectual tradition. And number 3, contrasting views of time. So notice at the outset, even before we go into these, the common humanity and the common intellectual tradition, that place of commonality is where he begins before he gets to the area of contrast and potential conflict. Well, what does he mean by common humanity? King addresses disagreement, and this is important, without demeaning those that disagree with him. I'm gonna let that settle in for a while. If I was using a good barbecue metaphor, which you could use down here, I would say, let that marinate. He disagrees without demeaning those with whom he disagrees. And then in one way he does this is he calls them men of goodwill. They have the right intention as far as King's concerned, even if they go about what they're doing the wrong way. And then he goes on to say the criticisms are sincerely set forth. I mean, I love this quote from Gandhi. I suppose leadership at one time meant muscle, but today it means getting people to get along with one another. And then not only is there's this common connection in terms of common humanity, which I think is more important even than the second thing, but there's a common intellectual tradition. King connects with them through the Bible, talking about Amos, Paul, and Jesus. Through American history, talking about Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. Indeed, Martin Luther King, whenever he was criticized for being an extremist, he would often quote Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. He had this one speech, and I'm going to go into all of it, Martin Luther King does, where he says, Thomas Jefferson was an extremist when he says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Abraham Lincoln was an extremist when he says, this nation can no longer live half slave and half free. And then he goes through a lot of other people, Martin Luther King does, and at the end of it, he says, the question is not being an extremist. The question is what kind of extremist you will be. And then he goes on to say, that's why I've decided to start a new organization, the Organization for Creative Extremism. But then the other part of the common intellectual tradition is not only the Bible, American history, but philosophy and theology. Martin Luther King quotes Socrates, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Paul Tillich, Martin Buber, all of whom at one time or another talked about how you handle injustice. But then Martin Luther King gets to what we would call the heart of the disagreement, because they really didn't believe, those 8 clergymen, that King should be there, nor did they believe that it was urgent that all of this stuff be solved right then. And so you can see sort of a look at these different words for time in the original Greek. Of course, there's chronos, having to do with this gradual time. There's kairos, having to do with opportune time. And then there's this aeon that speaks to eternal significance of time. And I kind of think that's really where King is going. King is saying that, yes, we need to deal with this immediately. Yes, we need to deal with this chronologically, but this issue is so important that whatever we do, whenever we do it, has eternal implications. And so when we talk about who a neighbor could be, that neighbor is anyone who might be struggling, as well as anyone who might have some other lesser needs. But what a neighbor should be, our responsibility is to make sure that we are on the eternal side of history and that we're acting accordingly. So before we get into our talk, then I have really 3 takeaway questions. I look forward to hearing any question you might have, but these are some takeaway questions to think about. How should the church view and leverage time in this current moment of racial unrest? Myra did a wonderful job talking about how during the 19th century, there was this Christian sensibility that the abolitionists have. During the 20th century, of course, there's this sensibility that people in the civil rights movement have. In fact, I find it intriguing as an academic and also humbling that in the 1930s and 40s, You had pragmatic philosophers who happened to be white, who seriously wanted to engage the issue of racism. You have politicians who wanted to attack the issue of racism. In fact, 1948 is when the Democratic Party splits at the Democratic Convention in 1948 between the Dixiecrats, who would support segregation, right? And then some of the Northern Democrats led by people like Hubert Humphrey. So there was definitely that division there. But just as you had the civil rights movement come along to recruit folk, some of whom were Christians, some of whom weren't, to capture this idea of racial injustice, you also had people who were opposed. That is to say, whether we're talking about the 19th century or the 20th century, you always had some folks in the church who responded to the moment, others who thought that it wasn't their business to respond to the moment. And some of that indeed has to do with this notion of separation of church and state and how that pans out in the minds of some. So how should the church view and leverage time in this current moment of racial unrest? Secondly, how do we listen to each other authentically and compassionately? You know, it's any conversation is hard. Any conversation that has to do with relationships are hard. So if you layer on top of that racial concerns, it becomes even more difficult. But I suspect that Christians have always had difficult conversations, and to some degree, they always need to. But the issue is to listen to each other authentically and compassionately. And I believe as a child of God that takes the word of God, the spirit of God, and the people of God to be committed to it. And then thirdly, how might the prophetic orientation contribute to this discussion? And when I talk about prophetic here, I'm not referring to foretelling. I'm referring to forthtelling. I'm referring to, again, that impulse that runs through the prophets, where you will criticize not only the larger culture, but you will also criticize the people of God. I mean, I'm intrigued whenever I read passages that say, prophets speaking for God. I don't want your sacrifices. I don't want your religious ritual. It's kind of confusing upon first blush, because God is the one that gave them the ordinances for sacrifices. But the prophetic orientation says no one is off limits when it comes to critiquing folks in and outside of the church who are not doing what God would ask. There are two pictures here of some gentlemen some of you might be acquainted with, some might not be. Jerry Taylor on top is a professor at Abilene Christian University, and he is the director of the Carl Spain Center for Racial Reconciliation. His work and their work would be a wonderful resource. Carl Spain was a white minister in the Church of Christ who spoke out against some of the racism that was being practiced at the Christian universities long before anyone else did. And so Jerry Taylor on top, the guy in the gray suit, he is the director of that Carl Spain Center. And then Don McLaughlin is a minister of the North Atlantic Church of Christ, and he too has been very involved with strategies for racial reconciliation. And although we will talk about some things, I commend you to look at their websites and to look at them as resources. So I want to stop there so we will have some time to talk. I'm probably not as long-winded as Cordelia and some folks remember, so that's a good thing. So let me stop sharing, and then let's see how many of you I can see as I do this. And now we will go to any questions you have. And of course, Myron, you and probably Teo will have to tell me when I've gone long. I'm going to tease Cordelia about a joke that only she and Myron will understand. You notice, Cordelia, there was no, I wish I had time, if I had time, right? So that's like an inside joke. The rest of y'all won't get that. Okay, let's entertain some of your questions.
So I have a question, David.
Hi, Jeffrey.
So I've seen the term, and in one organization I belong to, I've seen the term reparation, which I believe involves somehow making up for or compensating for the past. but I don't know much about it. And I'm just wondering if you could say a few words as to what that is, if you've heard about it, and you know what we should do about it.
So there has been for a number of years, well over 25 years, a discussion about reparations. And some of that discussion, quite frankly, is rhetorical to make a point. The reparations would involve paying the descendants of slave a certain amount of money. And I know of one thinker in particular that makes the amount of money so exorbitant that no one could ever pay it. So it's really kind of a redemptive payment. With some, it could come in the form of a financial recompense to again, the descendants of slave. For others, it would be all sorts of things. But the thing I think to remember is that there are a couple of things. Number one, even disagreement within the African American community about matters like that, whether that would be helpful or not. For example, there's one conservative African American scholar who says that any form of payment would be an insult because slavery is so horrible, right? And on the other side, you'll have someone who would say, no, there needs to be
Where are you going?
some payment made, just as there was for the Jews by the Germans to some degree after the Holocaust.
It's an interesting discussion.
So that's something to think about. But I think as Christians, we possibly got to think about larger relational issues. Sometimes justice calls for us to come out the pocket, as it were, but oftentimes it's a much larger and deeper undertaking. And so hopefully that helps. You can read if you need a reference, one reference to read for context, Jerry. You can read Randall's The Debt. The last name is Randall, right? And the book is The Debt. Or it might be Randall Robinson. I think it's Randall Robinson, The Debt. Okay. All right, other questions?
David, King talks about his disappointment in what he calls moderate Christians and their response to what he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
Come forward to 2020. Like I say, I know there isn't an African-American voice as such, but what's your response to the response of moderate Christians to some of these issues?
Yeah, I think, so to quote King, King was actually more disturbed by the moderate than he was by someone who used their religion to say blacks should be separated. And for me, it recalls in Revelation when the Bible talks about being lukewarm. The other thing to remember about King is King was someone who I think practiced tough love. In this sense, King was open to critique anyone, but he had compassion for everyone. So for example, when Medgar Evers was assassinated, part of the Mississippi NAACP on his own porch, this is what Martin Luther King said. He said, if death is the price that some must pay to save our white brothers from psychological death, there can be nothing more redemptive. Later on, just before he was assassinated, he referred to some people trying to kill him as sick white brothers. I want you to notice the construction of the phrase. They're sick for sure, but they're still white brothers. And so there's that. And then another example of his compassion but critique is King didn't believe in violence or condone violence for any reason. Let me underscore that, for any reason. And yet he said in his last book that in some cases at least, rioting is the language of the unheard. Notice that tension, right? On the one hand, they're just, he's not condoning it, but he's saying that there's there. I think in direct answer to your question, he would be disappointed if we were being what he called ministers without being prophets. He has this very interesting statement where he says, not everyone who's a minister is a prophet. And for me, that means, sort of to borrow from John, we're not supposed to be of the world, but we're supposed to be in the world. And to the extent that we can, we need to be engaged. We need to be the ones modeling what disagreement on these issues looks like, but also modeling what reconciliation looks like. Listen, I don't expect that all African-American Christians or all white Christians will see eye to eye on every issue. But when we ignore the discussion, that's a level of moderation that I think would have been sickening to King and is disturbing to me. Other questions?
Hi, yeah,
Next comment. I'm sorry, who's that?
Carmen.
Did you say, I'm sorry.
Wait, oh, hi, my name is Carmen.
Hey, how you doing, Carmen?
Good. So I was wondering, yeah, you were saying about people's ideas on the separation between church and state, and also I definitely agree with I had trouble with church and state for a long time. I remember teachers in my school used to tell me that all the time. But is it appropriate to speak about these things? I always believe that the Christian life shall meld in with other things. So would you agree? And how could I make an impact in this time?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think, thank you. I think it's some of this stuff is a tough call because, I mean, I recently heard a really powerful sermon based on that text where, somebody was trying to trick Jesus and they said, well, should we pay tribute to Caesar or not? And he says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar and to God's the things that are God's. It's always a challenge because, even for Martin Luther King, he believed that there were some points of view that were rooted in Christianity that should enter into the public sphere. I agree as well. But the trick becomes, how do you contribute to discussions in politics, in any other kinds of social questions without controlling them? Let me say that again. I believe that the church should contribute to discussions in the public sphere, but they shouldn't control it. And so to me, that's sort of like the tug of war that we face now, right? Do we have something to say about racial injustice? We should have something to say. Are we the ones that say that we should completely control what the government does in response to it? I don't agree with that. I do think as Christians, we register our concern as good citizens with our votes. That's very different than saying that we should turn this country into the church, or the Church of Christ in particular, especially with somebody's view of what the Church of Christ is. But that'd be kind of scary. So it's a matter of us saying, we voice what we voice as Christian citizens, but we don't ever presume that we have control over the government. Otherwise, there becomes an issue of rendering unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, to God the things that are God's. That's kind of my sense.
Yeah. So would you say that's the same as that's the same as the verse in the Bible that tells us that we should be about our own affairs and not in civilian affairs? Are you familiar with that passage?
Okay, so which passage are you referring to?
I can't remember where it is, but the words that Paul used was he was referring to the world as civilians, and talking about us being good Christian soldiers, but not getting into the affairs of the world.
Yeah,
like he's talking about.
I think you're referring to one of the passages in Timothy when Paul is talking to Timothy about being a good Christian soldier, particularly a good minister, and not being entangled into the affairs. And I sort of think that's slightly different than what we're talking about, but it's the same idea, right? Or the larger idea. And the larger idea being that, and I talked about this in the sermon, there are significant allegiances and then there are ultimate allegiances. For example, I often define, and I will always tell you when something's my opinion, this is completely my opinion. I often find that when I hear people talking about racial reconciliation, if you compare it to a car trip, going on a trip and the kids are in the back, and this is my opinion, totally my opinion, the extreme right is like the kid saying, are we there yet? I mean, we're talking about race forever. Are we there? And the extreme left is like, we'll never get there, you know, kicking the back of the seat saying we'll never get there, right? And so I think when we talk about issues of racial reconciliation, we have to think about the reality that human relationships grow in stages. But there is always this sense of an ultimate sense of identification and an anticipatory hope. The way I illustrate it is, one way I illustrate it is, Veronica and I got married 33 years ago, this past June. I guarantee you, if I was anything like I was when I was 25 and we got married, I probably wouldn't be married. She probably would be in jail. You know, not because, you know, you physically abused her because I didn't, not because I played on her because I didn't, right, sweet? But because you just develop and you just mature. I think the real challenge for us is, are we maturing in our relationship? Not that the relationship journey won't have bumps, they will. Racial relationships, just like any other relationship, will have bumps. But do we have an expectation that is actually beyond what's realistic, number one? And as the people of God, do we believe that the grace of God and the blood of Christ is powerful enough to bring us not all the way where we need to be, because that's heaven, right? But closer than we've ever been before. All right, so other
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
As a woman, I can feel a little bit how it is to be marginalized or to be not equal. And I can sympathize with that, or I can understand to a certain degree. And I definitely think there's injustice. Things need to change, and they should not change in the future. They should change now. But also, as a white person, how can I help? What can I do? I know in my personal relationships, I learned a lot, especially having the privilege to worship in an African-American church. And being from Europe, I have no idea. A lot of things are just very different concerning racial issues than here. So I learned a lot. But as a white person, sometimes I feel so helpless. And or I see the need, I see the injustice, I see something needs to be done, but maybe sometimes even being afraid, well, what should I do? What can I do? Do I do the right thing? Do I say the right thing? I do know that if I do it with honesty and with love and a good relationship, you know, that is, you can't do anything wrong if you do it in the right heart. But as a white person, also a little bit broader, what are the hopes of African American people, of Black people, that we do as white people?
As usual, my sister, you got a real layered question. So let me see if I can something. So the first layer to me, a priority for me is always personal relationship. You know, you don't just, it's not like, you know, shop for a Black day or let me go hunting for a Black friend. I'm not talking about that. Just organically, you develop relationships. And of course, that's just you. You love people. So no matter what color they are, you're going to develop relationships. The other thing I would recommend all people do, and I know you do this as well, is just read. I mean, in American culture, there's a whole lot you can read to learn more about not just African Americans, but other people on the margins. And what ends up happening is, I don't want this to sound like a kind of, I don't know, elitist professor, but in our culture, we don't read. I mean, I know you do, but I mean, we don't read. What we do is we Google. And if you haven't done it, you need to take a look at a Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma. Because what The Social Dilemma talks about, and some of us who like to read and also like to do Google, you shouldn't do Google, you should read. Some of us who like to read and also like to do Google and like to think, quite frankly, is what The Social Dilemma says is what we already know. The Social Dilemma basically says there are algorithms that if you look up something a few times, they'll simply send you only that information. Real quick example. If you're in the Midwest and you look up 1 or 2 anti-climate change articles. That is all you will get. It's algorithms that are trying to get you to think in a certain way. And so what I usually do to have fun is I'll have 1 week where I'm listing nothing but conservative stuff, ultra conservative stuff, and another week where I'm listing nothing but ultra, so they're confused with me. But I guess the point is, for Christians especially, we have to be gentle as servants, but so there's reading, there's hopefully having patience with yourself. And even though conversations are difficult, I think the closer you are to somebody, the easier it is to have difficult conversations. Unless you have like a really, really thick skin, and I know some of you do, and I know you do, Cordelia, I wouldn't go to just any conversation and begin talking about race, but I do think it's relational. I do think it's gradual, and I do think it involves just doing like a lot of reading and opening up yourself to the reality. I like the way you started, that we're all on the margins in some way. So you have to ask yourself, okay, I'm on the margin in terms of class, or I'm on the margin in terms of region or what have you. How would I like people to approach me? And that wouldn't be the only way to deal with it, right? But it will give you, it wouldn't give you a complete sense, but it will give you a partial sense of how you approach. I hope I peeled away 2 layers. You have like 5 or 6, we'll try to move on from there. Other questions?
This is Heather Black.
Hi, Heather.
We're going to cover part of my question in talking about how we have a personal response to some of these issues, and I appreciate your answer to that. It's been probably since high school, since I read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, and I really appreciated rereading it this week. His perspective is very wise, and I think that comes from his studies in God's Word and his commitment to live a Christian life and live that out in the ideals that he was pursuing with race relations. And so the other part of my question is, how do we as believers respond to something like the current riots, which honestly aren't, the current ones are, have been racially motivated, but I think within our society in general, our move away from Christianity and from morals and godliness has led to an inability to communicate effectively. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail is a very effective communication because he's grounded in truth. And so many of our society don't understand that truth anymore. And so how do we respond to something that is an important issue, like race relations, but is being played out in a way that is so hurtful to the society that's within? I mean, heart just aches to see people, like you said earlier, both the instigators and the recipients of violence are scarred by that process. How do we respond in a way that is empathetic to the concerns that are underlie without condoning some of the evil that goes on?
Yeah, I think, thank you for that. I think just in large part the way you said it. I mean, one of the things that separates, and not just Martin Luther King, there's a host of other people I could talk about, including white participants in the civil rights movement. Clifford and Virginia Durr. Clifford Durr was one of the attorneys that helped with the Montgomery bus boycott. In fact, they wouldn't allow this Black member of the NAACP to take or to bail Rosa Parks out of jail. And so Clifford Durr had to come, but I really love his wife because his wife was being interviewed in that series, Eyes on the Prize, if you're familiar with it, from the 1980s, that's a civil rights film series. So she was being interviewed, and she's from Alabama, grew up in Alabama, and somebody said to her, well, the governor of Mississippi at that time, a little bit later than Montgomery bus boycott, was a guy named Ross Burnett. So, well, Ross Burnett doesn't like the way you're standing up for Black folks, called Negroes then. And she kind of frowned up and she said, I don't care what that polecat says. And you and I all know, some women like that, they're supposed to be like nice Southern belles and all that. But when they need to tell you off, to tell you. Now, I'm not recommending that people call each other names. That's one of the problems we have now. But I think this notion of being willing to speak truth to power and extend accountability to whoever needs to be accountable. I mean, listen, I think no one can be vocal enough, my sister, about the distinction you just made. In other words, pounce on injustice wherever you find it, but pounce on it with your words, not with any violent action. And so I think it's very important to like discount. I mean, that's one of my concerns always, right? Either side, when people do not renounce things that are wrong. So I think as Christians, we've got to renounce what's wrong, and we have to be very clear about the lines of accountability and what those are. So, and the other thing too to remember is you're quite right. We can miss something important when we are distracted by unnecessary and violence. So thank you. My short answer is that we need to just do a better job speaking up and calling out those distinctions you just mentioned.
I appreciate that. I actually have a little bit of a follow-up to that. One of the other things I appreciated about Dr. King's letter was he had very clear objectives in some of the things that he wanted to change, specifically in Birmingham, but overall with race relations at the time. I'm not seeing the same clarity in some of the things that are being called for in today's frustrations and things, or at least not things that are pragmatic to achieve. You can't defund every police department nationwide and expect there to be, law and order. So that's, I think, would be kind of that extreme left view that you mentioned before. But how do we step forward, and what things should we be speaking up for as far as, coming together and rebuilding some of those walls that have been breaking down the walls, building bridges between people groups that don't understand each other as well as we should.
There's I mentioned the Center for Racial Reconciliation, but there are other efforts. I just was a part of one yesterday. There's an effort in Nashville where the churches are trying to get their discourse together. Black and white churches in Nashville who are starting to talk, and out of the context of a relationship are starting to work through it. Because I think one of the problems is you talk about King's objectives. Well, part of his objectives are clear to us because we have a greater context of history. If you talk to Andrew Young, who was one of King's lieutenants, he would say that it didn't often appear to be as clear either to them or to the people they were trying to lead. For example, Birmingham wasn't working out for King like other campaigns were. And so Martin Luther King ended up in jail because he just led an impromptu march in Birmingham. But I do think what you're talking about speaks to what we just shared, and that is, and again, this is going to sound like such a professor's answer, but we're not clear with our language. For example, if you look at the idea of defunding the police, the people who are using that don't mean the same thing, right? Black Lives Matter. There are so many different members of Black Lives Matter, and I tell my students, one size member description doesn't fit all. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement in its founding is influenced by the civil rights movement, but they tell you they're not controlled by the religious ideology. Okay, someone said, okay, they're not religious. Yeah, but if you read this book, and I recommend that you read it, a book by Andre Johnson, it's a book that deals with a lot of quantitative data. It's called The Struggle for Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. The Struggle for Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. And what they do in that book is they show you there's some people who totally turned on to religion because of the social justice agenda of Black Lives Matter. And then there's some people who go in the other direction. And we're talking about whites and blacks who are either turned on to religion because of Black Lives Matter or turned off from religion because of Black Lives Matter. And so I think the point is that you're making quite well is we really need to be clearer on our language. Because again, half of the stuff that half of people are talking about, I have no idea what they mean, right?
Amen.
And I call it specialized, I don't even know what you're talking about. That's why I think the church has to be constantly having conversation. This is a strategy. The church across racial lines has to constantly be having conversations within their congregations and among congregations. And it might start with some really simple things, right? Like a lot of the themes that you hear in the world. Well, what do people mean when they mean Black Lives Matter? What do they mean when they're talking about this issue or that issue? And the other thing I would say, because we're running out of time, and I always share this with folks, we should be ready to approach any idea the way we approach a good piece of fish, and that is get rid of the bones. Don't assume any idea from God. Listen to what I'm saying. Right, left, or center. Don't assume that any idea that's not from God is sacrosanct. It doesn't have bones in it. Okay, let me push the envelope farther. I still believe that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are some of the finest documents ever written on freedom. Now, I'm gonna test you, y'all know history. Did the Constitution have some bones in it? Now, say if I were at Westchester, I would say, can I get a witness? Did this Constitution that we all love, that my daddy fought during World War II for, did it have bones in it? Can I get a witness? Come on, y'all. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have some value. It has a lot of value, which is what Martin Luther King does when the Declaration of Independence, when he says, this nation, in the I Have a Dream speech, this nation will one day live out the true meaning of its creed. What does that mean? That it's good. It is. It had a ways to go. So yeah, I think we have a long ways to go, my sister, with the notion of communication. But one of the things that church can always serve as, and this is a king too, we can always serve as a moral compass. Because as you're suggesting, even when we are not clear about the pathway forward, we are clear about what God wants. And God desires us to be together. And God desires us to have a love for each other. And God desires for us to know what a neighbor could be and a neighbor should be. So let me share this very quickly. I taught at Pepperdine for almost 26 years, just shy of 26 years. I lived in Los Angeles, but of course, Pepperdine is in Malibu. Sometimes day or night, I would be pulled over. My exact count is between 11 to 12 times I was pulled over by the police. I was never given a ticket for speeding. The last time I was pulled over was about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. The fellow that pulled me over, it was at night. And ironically, it was at night after I finished teaching a class on Sidney Poitier, if you know who that is, Sidney Poitier's films and the civil rights movements. How ironic, right? You almost have to laugh at that, right? And so I get pulled over, and the police officer asked for my license. It was really dark. He goes back to his car, and he was there at least 20 minutes. I mean, it took so long that he could have checked my plates and checked my credit. I mean, it took a really long time. All right. And so he came back and he says, well, I want to know why you're on the road here, here in Malibu. I said, well, I teach at Pepperdine University. And he says, well, what do you do there? I said, well, I'm a professor of English. And he literally does this. You're a professor of English? He says, well, that's odd. Not odd. If I speak English, I probably got it. I said, well, how long have you been doing that? I said, well, about since 1993. He says, I was in high school then. And then he just gave me a warning about the fact that my light wasn't quite bright enough. I looked at it later and it seemed fine to me, but I don't know. And he drives off, and I was thinking, I wonder how many people I have taught are either pulling somebody over or being pulled over. But then I said, for me, as a Christian, even though I've been pulled over 11 or 12 times, I want you to be very clear, and I think you are very clear about this. If I were to be driving down that same road and any police officer was in a ditch, God would not excuse me if I didn't reach out. I would have to reach out, because that's what Christians do. And only we can model that. Maybe we should encourage our citizens to model that, but we have to model that. That's what I mean when I say That's what a neighbor should be. A neighbor is somebody who should recognize their duty to folks, even those who marginalize them. And I've been really pushing that for all of us, because all of us are on the margins in some ways. Maybe not as much or as profoundly as others. I want to be clear about that. There are levels of intensity with marginalization, but people have been marginalized on different levels. It seems to me God still doesn't give us an excuse who are on the margins not to love those who are. So I don't know, where are we on time, Myron?
I think we're doing all right. Teresa asked a question. She wants to get a reading list from you. I'm assuming you have something you could send me and I can pass on.
Yeah, I mean, Teresa, depends on how much you want to read. I mean, you know, I can send you some of the stuff that I'm going to do in a class next semester. I can, you know what? I think I'll send you a list that our older son helped to put together because it's a really good introduction. And then he has a section that focuses on Jonathan, Myron Cordelia. He has a section that focuses on specifically Christian reconciliation. That is the most important, brothers and sisters, but I think people often need context because they come to certain conclusions that really show that, like all of us, myself included, we need some background reading. But yeah, I'll try to remember that. Honey, you remember the thing Jonathan sent us on Google Docs? I'll try to remember to send that to y'all.
Any more questions for David? Well, David, this has been a delight. Thank you so much for being willing to, like I said, there's not many benefits to a pandemic, but having you be in Nashville and still be able to be with us here is a plus. And,
well, after the pandemic, I'm gonna be total full disclosure, right? We're talking about relationship. After the pandemic, got to go to Boston primarily to see my folks, the Shires and company, but listen, y'all got to hook me up on some crabs or lobster or something. When this is over, Lord willing, we come out there because I think, again, relationally, the Zoom is okay, but it's nothing like being able to shake folks' hand and all that kind of stuff, and to let people know, look them in the eye and let them know that you really appreciate them. Because Tony and I are fast friends. I don't even know how tall you are, man. I have no clue, but I already know that I'm obligated to love you with the love of the Lord, but I actually liked you when I met you, so that's a cool.
Yeah, we'll walk you down Boston besides Boston University where Dr. King did some studying.
That's right. He got his doctorate, yeah.
That's great.
All right, well, I'll stop recording now, but again, thank you very much. And so happy that Veronica could also be with us. Thank you. And thanks for putting those notes in, Veronica, about the book titles.
Yeah.